Well, we're up to over half the teams that are currently in the NHL existing. And it's kind of a rough time to start for one of them. But the pain isn't going to last very long for that team. Montreal leads the way at 52, 10, and 16. The Atlanta Flames, I used Calgary for this, are added to the West, while the Islanders are added to the East, which means that, yes, Vancouver is still in the East and Atlanta's in the West. It's all about competitive balance. And it sucks for Vancouver, but it's something that the Vancouver Canucks organization would get used to. And unfortunately, Vancouver players would get used to. There's always been talk over the years of how the injured list for the Canucks can sometimes be longer, and maybe it's from fatigue for the amount of traveling the team does. But, as I said, Montreal leads the way. Boston's second at 51, 22, and 5. The Rangers 47, 23, and 8, followed by Buffalo at 37, 27, and 14. So Buffalo is emerging as a good team, and we're finally starting to look like, well, a league. After the original 6 expanded to 12, it looked like there was 6, and then there was 6, and the 1-6 was pretty good, and the other 6 just sucked. And we're no longer in that stage. Detroit 37, 29, and 12. Toronto 27, 41, and 10. Vancouver 27, 47, and 9. And the Islanders at 12, 60, and 16. Or 12, 60, and 6, I should say. They didn't get 16 ties that year. The interesting thing, too, is that this means that half the teams make the playoffs and half the teams don't. The NHL's got to fix that, because that's not enough teams making the playoffs. There's not enough playoff revenue. And if you think about it, they could have stayed at 8 teams making the playoffs right through the 80s. And it would have knocked out a lot of interesting playoff runs and a lot of Cinderella stories. But if they'd stay with quarterfinals, semifinals, and finals, and only gone to 16 when they got to, say, 24 teams, 30 teams, whatever you want to do. I think that having a playoffs that there's and you guys will see this when we hit the 80s. You don't have to be a good team to make the playoffs. You just have to not be abysmal. It's kind of sad. Anyways, in the West, Chicago 42, 27, and 9. Philadelphia 37, 30, and 11. They're tied with Minnesota for that record, followed by St. Louis at 32, 34, and 12. Pittsburgh 32, 37, and 9. LA 31, 36, and 11. Here's Atlanta. I told you they got good goaltenders. 25, 38, and 15 with Phil Muir and Dan Bouchard as their goalies. And here's the California Seals at 16, 46, and 16. So California's been in the league since 1967. The Islanders just joined. The Islanders got 4 less wins, and the Islanders would not have been happy with those 12 wins as their total. The good news is, because California wasn't so bad that they could get the number 1 draft pick, the number 1 draft pick goes to the Islanders, and the Islanders draft Denny Potvin. If Denny Potvin had ended up in California, I mean, really, like, it's one of those things that everywhere you look on this board, everything works against the Seals. They traded away a draft pick that was Guy Lafleur. They narrowly miss out on Denny Potvin. I doubt they're a 16-win team with Guy Lafleur and with Denny Potvin coming in. Anyways, again, it's quite the history that the Seals have, and it's not one that's very much longer for this world. They will get moved, and then they will get absorbed. There will be an absorption draft of sorts. Well, not really a draft. Eventually, the remnants of this become Minnesota North Stars property. But in other big news, the WHA started this year, and they took Jerry Cheevers, Bernie Perrant, J.C. Tremblay, and Bobby Hull signed a 10-year, $2.75 million contract. So when we talk about costs spiraling out of control, remember, it's just a couple of videos ago I'm talking about Bobby Orr getting $75,000. And then Bobby Hull got $100,000. Now Bobby Hull's getting $275,000 a year. So it's spiraling quickly. And the WHA uses that money to get guys to come over. Of course, the problem is the WHA is losing money immediately. There's very little profit to be had. What the WHA finds is that by creating a 12-team league, without any kind of foundation, it's really hard to build, and eventually it won't work. What the NHL finds at this point is the talent level in the league is really severely diluted. Canada versus USSR. The Canada-USSR Summit is held before this season. So the famous Henderson goal is now in the past. So there you go. We're now past the Summit Series. The Whalers won the Avco Cup in the WHA, the championship. And they actually put out a challenge to the NHL, like, hey, send your Stanley Cup champions to face us one game. And the NHL just ignored it. The relationship between the NHL and the WHA is acrimonious at best, and it doesn't really get better. June 26, 1972, the New York Islanders buy Chico Resch from the Montreal Canadiens. So that's key, because Chico Resch is going to be a really solid goaltender for the Islanders for a while and go on to a very solid career. February 6th, 1973, Connie Madigan plays his first game in the NHL at age 38. He did so for the St. Louis Blues. They won the game 5-1 because they were playing the hapless Canucks. Notice that the Canucks also have fewer wins than the expansion Flames. This is kind of just the way that history works against Vancouver for the most part. Bobby Orr is now the first player as of this season to ever win the same trophy 6 years in a row. And that will be the Norris Trophy, because it's his. He owns it. The Hart Trophy goes to Bobby Clarke. Bobby Clarke emerges as a huge star this year. Philly's on the rise. Clarke is at the basically at the center of their rise, and Bill Barber's joined this team. This team is going to be a Stanley Cup champion soon. The Art Ross goes to Phil Esposito of the Bruins. Norris goes to Bobby Orr of the Bruins. The Calder goes to Steve Vickers of the New York Rangers. I had a Steve Vickers card in 1970 from 1978, which was one of my favorites. I thought the name sounded cool. It was a cool looking card. That's where I first saw the Rangers jersey with the crest on the front, not just Rangers written across it, but with the actual crest. It looked fantastic to me. The Vezina goes to Ken Dryden of the Montreal Canadiens. It is still awarded for goals against average. So goals against average is what wins you the Vezina. It's not voted on until later. And we're almost up to the season where Montreal ruined it for everybody. The Lady Byng goes to Gilbert Perreault of the Buffalo Sabres. The Masterton Trophy goes to Lowell McDonald of the Pittsburgh Penguins. The Pearson Trophy goes to Bobby Clarke of Philadelphia. So here you see for the first time the MVP is awarded to Bobby Clarke, and the best player in the league is given to Bobby Clarke. So the same player wins it 2 years in a row. Or the same player wins both awards in the same year for the first time. I didn't sleep great last night, so I apologize for where I trip over my tongue. The Conn Smythe goes to Yvon Cournoyer of the Montreal Canadiens. History is replete with Canadian victories, isn't it? Walter L. Bush Jr. gets the Patrick Award for growing the game in the States. I don't think he's related to the presidents, but never know. Maybe. Walter L. Bush Jr. It sounds like something that you'd hear at a country club somewhere. Anyways, playoffs. The quarterfinals go this way. Montreal, first place, plays fourth place Buffalo. They beat Buffalo in 6. So Buffalo shows up against Montreal. Montreal's pretty much a juggernaut. The fact that Buffalo extends them to 6 looks pretty good. Again, these expansion teams are starting to look like they're going to be a threat for a Stanley Cup soon. The Rangers over Boston in 5. So the Boston Bruins, defending Stanley Cup champions, play the New York Rangers. This is where two of the best teams in the league are against each other. And since there's no internet to whine and cry about it, not a whole lot is said about two of the best records playing against each other and the Rangers winning it, so the Boston Bruins being out. If you want to prove you're the best, you might as well play the best early and prove it. Chicago beats St. Louis in 5. Philadelphia beats Minnesota in 6. So the Philadelphia Flyers are starting to roll in the playoffs. Semifinals, Montreal stops that roll of the Flyers in 5. And Chicago stops the Rangers in 5. Now, Chicago does this without Bobby Hull, and I think that's important to note. Bobby Hull has gone to the WHA, and the Chicago Blackhawks are still at the top. And they're still doing relatively well. Relatively well meaning Stanley Cup Finals. Stanley Cup Finals, Montreal wins Game 1 8-3, and they win Game 2 4-1. So Montreal's home and cold, but Chicago wins Game 3 7-4. Montreal wins in Chicago in Game 4 4-0 to go up 3-1. Then Chicago, in the highest scoring Stanley Cup Finals game in history to this date, and I mean to when this video was made, to this year that I'm talking about in this video, because I almost guarantee that there's something that's gone past 15 goals by now. We'll get to it in the 80s, is my guess. But Chicago ekes out an 8-7 win in Montreal, which had to feel pretty good. They're going home down 3-2, and Montreal wins in Chicago 6-4 to win the Stanley Cup. Your 1973 Stanley Cup champions, these guys. And I've given up on figuring out which hat jersey combination have I not done yet. Part of the reason I started buying Montreal hats even was I told him I said, there's a lot of Montreal Stanley Cups coming up. I've got to get a hat. I've tried shake it up a little bit. In the playoffs, goal leader is Yvon Cournoyer. Your assist leader is Dennis Hull of the Chicago Blackhawks. So they just traded out Hulls. Bobby's gone. Okay, Dennis, your turn. And Pat Stapleton, also of the Hawks, has 15 assists. Wins leader, Ken Dryden with 12, and Tony Esposito with 10. Phil didn't have any. He's got as many wins in net as Claude Giroux, and I really think they're underrated as goaltenders. First team All-Stars, Phil Esposito of the Bruins, Mickey Redmond of Detroit, Frank Mahovlich of the Montreal Canadiens, Bobby Orr of the Bruins, Guy Lapointe of the Montreal Canadiens makes his first appearance as a first team All-Star, and Ken Dryden of the Montreal Canadiens is your first team in goal. Second team, Bobby Clark of the Flyers, Yvon Cournoyer of the Montreal Canadiens, Dennis Hull of the Chicago Blackhawks on the left wing, Brad Park, Bill White of the Rangers and the Blackhawks, and then Tony Esposito of the Chicago Blackhawks. So this is an era where, again, the Hawks have looked since 1961 like a team that should win another Stanley Cup and just can't get over that hump. But they will continue to try. Meanwhile, Philadelphia is lurking in the weeds. And Buffalo is getting ready to go on a nice big run too. So we are at a stage where, as I said, the talent's kind of watered down and scoring is up. But we're getting to the point where I am very familiar with the players. I'm very familiar with the organizations, the people in charge. We're not up to the point where I started watching hockey yet, but we're getting close. So there you go. Your 1972-73 season, your Stanley Cup champions. It's Montreal again, because of course it is, and that will change tomorrow. But we'll get into that tomorrow. But thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happen upon this video. And I'll talk to you again soon.